in Twelfth Night, or What You Will, Malvolio, who's the comic villain, who's trying desperately, he's been fed a lie, which is that Olivia, his mistress, is madly in love with him. She's not. And he's been fed this lie by people who want to embarrass him. And so he dresses up in exactly the sort of thing that we know that Olivia hates, principally yellow stockings. And he comes upon Olivia and he says, some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And he's just a pompous ass of a character. And so it's a pompous ass of a line to say. And, Marshall, I thought it would be a lot of fun to put Shakespeare's words in Frankie, because when we originally thought, Des and Marshall and I, of organizing the play into 4 acts, as it were, spring, summer, fall, winter, we knew that Tommy would be the voice of spring, because Tommy was the inciting incident of the 4 seasons was Tommy DeVito,
right? Who
was, organizing a group, making a group. The summer, the full bloom of their success, would have to be narrated by Bob, because once Bob joined the group was when they, his songwriting skills are what separated the 4 seasons from bands that were just covering other people's songs. Right. And we knew that Nick would have to narrate the dissolution of the quartet, because in real life, Nick, of course, was the first person to depart the group. And which left Frankie with Winter. We wanted Frankie to have the final word, but it also meant that Frankie had Winter. And I used to call it, again, as a sort of a Shakespeare thing, the idea of that it was the winter of Frankie's discontent, which of course is not Twelfth Night. It's of course Richard III. The very first line of Richard III is he comes down. He's watching a funeral. There's a funeral happening upstage.
Yeah.
And he's about to explain to the audience in a wonderful piece of writing, that's one of the great acting gifts in the world, David, is Richard III's speech to the audience, because he gets to come down to the audience and say, first of all, look at me, look how ugly I am. I've got this hump on my back. I've got like a little half of an arm, it's like, look at me. Now here's what I'm gonna do. I am going to, see that woman over there who's mourning the death of her husband? She's, all sad. I'm gonna get her right now. I'm gonna get her. I'm going to seduce her right now. You think I can't do it because look at me, right? Watch this. Watch how awful and horrible I'm gonna be. He tells us what he's gonna do, and then he goes off and he does it, which is a great thing for a villain to do, because of course, even though he's a horrible villain, we're completely on his side because he's trusting us. That kind of direct address is something that we very much had in mind as we were starting to write Jersey Boys and provide direct address for each of the 4 seasons. So at the very end, when it's winter, we dedicated the idea of the 4 seasons and the winter of Frankie's discontent to Shakespeare in that moment giving Frankie the final word. As the narrator of the winter section of the show, the final act of the show, because of course the last word should be Frankie Valli's. It's his group. He's the front man. He's the star of the group, and his voice is the famous voice that that we still love so much on the recordings. And so there is this there is this kind of Shakespeare undercurrent through all of Jersey Boys, which sounds very fancy, but
it's the conscious genius, as we call it on the show.
Yeah, that's wow.
In one of Frankie's monologues, where he's talking about Francine, and he says that things are getting better between us. I have a question: is that line meant to be acted happy or sad? Because that's right before the phone rings. And according to Oh Hello, what Steve Martin likes to tell us was that, if you're happy, you pick up the phone sad, and if you're sad, you pick up the phone happy.
Frankie has just said everything's copacetic.
Right.
which is, we know what
Right.
that means, right? Everything's fine, copacetic, sort of a jazz term,
Right.
that we threw in there for the
Yeah.
musician to say, instead of cool or, fine, okay.
So musician, my God.
It's, everything's copacetic. And at the moment, and this is why it's fun to write drama. At the
Right.
moment that he says everything's fine, the phone rings and suddenly everything is as bad as it could possibly be, a parent's worst nightmare.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's the answer to your question. Is he supposed to be happy or is he supposed to be sad? He's supposed to be in a completely optimistic mode at that point, to the extent that Frankie, the character of Frankie can be. I mean, because Frankie is not, sort of a happy-go-lucky kind of a guy, as painted by Jersey Boys. He's a serious artist. He's had a serious life. He's had lots of things to deal with. But at this point, everything is copacetic. It's cool. He's taking a breath. He can finally relax. And then the phone rings and the worst possible thing happens. And that propels him into the final beat of that section of the show.
Now,
Right.
can we ask a clarifying question?
You can ask.
All of the direct addresses are happening in the present day, right? 2004, 2005.
Yeah.
So it's so interesting. I mean, watching Aaron, he's the one that we've seen the most do the show. It's like, so he says everything's copacetic, the phone rings, and it's like he knows what's going to happen because he's in present day. He's telling us what happened.
Is in the present moment, and then as soon as he picks up the phone, he is acting in the context of the terrible moment where he found out that his daughter was dead. He gets this terrible call from the hospital or the police, and then he hangs up the phone, and then he immediately is back to us, speaking about
Motherfucker with the needle.
how he. Well, yeah, I wasn't going to actually say that because I don't want people to fall out of their chairs, his self-lacerating comments about his kid are again to us until the priest shows up and sits down with him, and then he's in that particular moment. So I think that it's true that when the characters are addressing us directly, they are stepping out of the present moment of the action and stepping into the present moment in the theater.
Right, exactly.
Because there's a trend in the direct addresses where, so Frankie says, and we talk and it's all getting better between us. Phone rings. He still has another thought that he wants to say. Then he gets into the adiposa notata line, this too shall pass. When I come to realize it cuts both ways, the bad passes, but also the good. I feel like that line, this is just how I interpreted it, is that like it subconsciously, like he's in between both moments as he's talking.
Exactly.
That's why we wrote almost entirely. We wrote the direct address passages in what's called the historical present, as opposed to using past tense. So you can say things are getting better between us instead of things were getting better between us. Everything was fine, and then this terrible thing happened. So to make it all feel present in the present tense, we use the historical present tense in the in the narration sections of the show.
It's actually
the historical present tense.
It's actually one of our favorite moments. I mean,
So I go to the drugstore and I buy myself a pack of cigarettes. That's a historical present tense. If I were speaking to you, outside of the theater, I would say, I went to the drugstore and I bought myself a pack of cigarettes.
Right.
And you would know that was something that happened then, whenever then is. But if I say, so I go to the drugstore and I walk up to the counter and I say, hi, how are you? Let me have a pack of cigarettes. You don't know exactly when that happened, but I'm sort of narrating you through the past tense by speaking about it in the historical present. Historical because it's already happened, it's history, but describing the historical event in the present tense, which is why it's called historical present.
Rick, sir, that is genius for two reasons that I just thought of right now, because that's how Italians talk. Like we never talk and like, oh yeah, I went to the store and it's like, yeah, so it's like, so I says to the guy, I do this and then I do that. That's how we talk. And plus it totally works with the way that you set up the show chronologically.
Yeah, but it also
Yeah.
makes it gives the audience the feeling that it's all happening now for
Right.
the first time, as opposed to being recounted, which
Right.
means that somehow, I mean, which sort of removes the events of the story from the present moment, which affects our emotional involvement with the story. You know, it was all part of casting the audience at the theater in the role of audience in the, you know, at the club, at the stadium, at the concert, at the, you know, at the, you know, at the beach, you know, wherever they were performing the songs, and they perform the songs out to the audience is cast in the role of the audience at that moment on the steel pier, wherever they happen to be. And
wherever I happen to be. Yeah.
you know, for the audience to keep feeling like this is all happening in the present moment, it was important, I think, to make the decision to have those narrative passages in the historical present. And as you said, it also feels authentic to the Italian, to Italian American English.
Right. Yes. I have a question about copacetic. Okay, so it feels so with, you know, with my Italian American heritage, Italian American men tend to use one fancy, sophisticated word every 100 words they say. Was that a pattern that you noticed, like, or that you have noticed throughout your entire life, and that's kind of how you structured the language?
I should just say yes, because
it's a loaded question.
No, I mean, I never really thought about it before. Frankie Valli, the man, is a very, very dapper, bright, articulate guy. He also is an expert at what he does, and he is a lyric factotum, which is, you know, why in that same section of the show that we're talking about, where he recites the lyric to a song. It's because when you're talking to Frankie, he does that a lot. He will, and, you know, and Gaudio says, Frankie, the guy who wrote the lyric doesn't remember what it is, but Frankie remembers it. And Frankie remembers every lyric to every song from the 20th century, whether it's a Four Seasons song or not. So, you know, he'd be great on, you know, stump the lyricist, or name that tune version of where, you know, you hear a line of a lyric without the melody, and Frankie Valli would win every day. So to capture his particular personality involves demonstrating that while he may not have had a college education, he's a very articulate, very intelligent guy who's very good at expressing himself. He's lived a full life and met a lot of people, and his vocabulary is a sophisticated one.
Wow. Thank you for telling us that, because I feel like not everyone knows that, and because the show is so relatable, where it's, you know, four guys from Belleville, you know, people don't automatically think that he would be at such a high caliber.
Oh yeah. Oh, and he's dapper as hell. You know, it's unbelievable. I mean, I've been on really long air flights with Frankie, and when I get off an airplane, you know, I look like I've been on 8 airplanes. You know, as you know, and he comes off, and he always looks absolutely put together, and he's got he's very, very well organized, very, very dapper. He's an interesting character. Very, very sophisticated in many, many ways that people might not attribute to somebody that they think of as just being like this sort of short Italian frontman for a band from a long time ago.
Right. Wow. Well, case in point. Now we know that. I think I needed to know that background a little bit more about the man himself, which is so cool.
Yeah, he's something.
Yeah. We have another question. So
I hope you have at least one more.
Oh, we have 500 questions.
I mean, I've set aside for 3 weeks. I mean, I don't know, you know, we're only 15 minutes into this thing.
True. So how do you decide which? It sounded like Kinabutify. How do you decide what lines are more cut and dry, where, like you mentioned before, you are telling the audience is hearing what's going to happen, know that just the direct way of hearing information, versus a more nuanced example? Because when you have Nick Massey, where he says, "No, it just came out of my mouth," that's something that everyday people say, something that we think about whenever maybe we made a mistake and we're thinking about our decisions in life. But then you have Tommy, who just does and says what he wants. How do you decide what lines are more nuanced for the audience and which ones are more direct to let an actor know how to deliver a line? Is that a weird question?
Well, it's. I think that's actually many questions. I think, but
Yeah.
you know, the Nick Massey line that you're citing was an opportunity for Marshall and me as the writers of the show to invent something because Nick wasn't there to tell us. So it's a reasonable question. Why, you know, why'd you do it, Nick? Why'd you leave the group? Reasonable question, because as he poses to the audience, you know, everything was going great. I mean, I stuck with the group through all the rough times. Why on earth would I pick the time when we were at the top to just walk away? Why'd you do it? He would ask himself that question. But of course, we couldn't have that conversation with him.
Right.
So we got to just do what dramatists like to do, which is to just make something up. And there was, you know, even Bob and Frankie and Tommy couldn't say, no, that wasn't right, because they wouldn't know what was in Nick's head. Only Nick would know what was in Nick's head. So we got to get into Nick's head instead, which is why we came up with, rather than try to invent a reason that would feel false, we invented a reason, as you said, that everybody said at one point in their life, which is, it just came out of my mouth. And as soon as it did, I knew that was what I had to do. And it's a moment where the audience recognizes in his behavior something that they have done themselves, and therefore their affection for Nick goes through the roof. And then, of course, he's also about to demonstrate, after confessing that his own children called him Uncle Nick because he was, you know, always off with other women and, you know, was not a model father to his kids, that, you know, he finally learned the lesson that there's maybe more important things than being on the road singing songs and picking up girls who'd written their phone numbers on cocktail napkins every night. And he's going to go home and spend some more time with his kids. So what we're doing there really is, you know, it's like, you know, at the end of the Miss America contest, they go down the row of contestants and say, you know, what would you like to do to make the world a better place?
Yes.
And they all have their answers, world peace, whatever, you know, and they're all trying to get the audience to vote for them, you know.
Right.
And in a way, those 4 speeches at the end of the show, those, you know, sort of American graffiti speeches at the end of Jersey Boys, are all about, you know, are really the characters saying, you know, are you going to side with my version of this story? You're going to be my version, you're going to be my version. So there he is, you know, sort of explaining that he's, you know, a good guy after all. He behaves the way we've all behaved. He's self-deprecating, you know, when there's 4 guys and you're Ringo, he understands that he's, you know, in many ways the fourth of the quartet. And it's endearing. And, you know, and then Des gave him this amazing exit, which is to, you know, the heaven exit,
Walking
which is
across the
only
bridge.
the characters who, you know, that we're never going to see again get to make that exit up the spiral staircase and then upstage and then off stage right. And it's a long exit. And he's the only one who gets to do that. That was, and that's Des helping out that storytelling through blocking, which is, of course, you know, why the theater is so much better than reading something on a page.
Right. Which is so gorgeous.
Did you guys invent Uncle Nicky, like that whole thing? No.
No. We were told that by Bob and Frankie and Tommy at various points. You know, at the beginning of our process, Marshall and I really functioned more as journalists.
Right.
And we did a lot of interviewing of these guys, and then we switched hats and became dramatists. And that was the work that we did by ourselves and in concert with Des. But in the journalist part, You know, we asked them a lot about Nick, and then later, Nick's son, Nick Massey Jr., came to audition for the show, and
wow.
and he confirmed he confirmed the Uncle Nicky.
Wow.
To us, yeah, that was pretty wild. You know, I was sitting next to Gaudio at the audition, and in came Nick's son, and what he did was, for his audition, was he sang Nick's harmony line. He didn't sing the he didn't sing the melody line of Sherry. He sang the harmony line of Sherry without any any other vocal. So
the bass,
it was unforgettable.
Wow.
And that's why I haven't forgotten it.
That makes sense.
Yes,
if it's unforgettable, that's why.
Yeah.
That's
awesome. When did you start the interview process?
When? You mean like what date?
Well, so
like what year?
Well, I got a call from a former client of mine. I used to work at an advertising agency for 20 years. I was the creative director of an advertising agency, and one of my clients was a music industry guy. It was probably a little mobbed up, and I was no longer at the ad agency. I was working as creative consultant at the Walt Disney Studio, and I was out in Burbank, and the phone rang one day, and I picked it up, and it was this fellow. And it was about a year after Mamma Mia opened on Broadway.
So that was 2001. So that was Mamma Mia opened in 2001.
Yeah. So he called and he said, "Hey, I've got the rights to the Four Seasons music. What do you think about doing a Broadway musical with the Four Seasons music?" And I said, "Well, I love Vivaldi, but you know, this is. But you really think a whole show?" And he said, no, you idiot. Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. And I said, "The guy with the high voice? Yeah, I remember those records when I was, 3. What? He said, "Well, I think we could do a Mamma Mia with the Four Seasons songs." And I said, being, a kind of over-educated, show-offy, obnoxious person, said, "Well, but somebody's already done that. Why would you want to do this? Why do you want to do what somebody's already done?" And he, I'm sure rolled his eyes. I'm also sure that he must have called everyone he knew before he called me. It's not like, oh, I know, I'm going to call this guy who's never written a musical before and ask him to write a musical. He must have spoken to 1,000 people, all of whom had said no. So I was probably the last call he would ever make. And so out of desperation, he said, "Look, do me a favor, just have lunch with the guy." "Who?" "Frankie Valli. He's going to want to have lunch with Frankie Valli and Bob Gaudio." "Who's that?" "Well, he's another guy from the group, and he's the guy who wrote the songs. Have lunch with the two of them and then decide." And I said, "Oh, okay." And I called my friend Marshall Brickman. One of the things that I tried to do at Disney was bring writers that I knew had great screenplays into the studio, and maybe the studio would make the movie, and that's what I was trying to do with several screenplays that Marshall had at the time, or was working on. And so I called him and I said, "Look, suppose we write a Broadway musical together." And he said, "I don't know how to do that. I've never done that." And I said, "Well, neither have I." So here's what would happen. We would waste some time of our own. They're not gonna pay us anything to do it, but maybe there's something to do, and maybe we'd have some fun. And I owed him some poker money, and I said, and that way, and if it becomes a show, then I won't owe you the poker money I owe you. And so that was why Marshall attended this lunch, and we met on 46th Street at the back of a dark Italian restaurant, and there was Bob and Frankie and Marshall and me, and we just started chatting the way that one does, and it's a free lunch. It's a free lunch. I thought, all right, this will be interesting. Marshall is like you, David. Marshall has a degree in music. He's a very accomplished musician, a great
Wow.
Marshall, really?
a great gold record banjo player. If you've ever seen the movie Deliverance with that
Yes.
famous banjo duet, that's Marshall Brickman and his roommate Eric Weisberg, I think is his name.
Oh my
Marshall's very, very achieved. Marshall played in a band with John Phillips and Michelle Phillips before the Mamas and the Papas.
Wow.
You know, Marshall knows about music. He's, you know, very through his talent and through his education, and he was a little bit of a snob about pop music, because it's a simpler form of music, and he's into, you know, music and music theory and all that. So he, but of course there were some of the songs that he knew, and I played him a section of a movie called The Deer Hunter, which was a very important movie to me in 1979 when it came out, because I was doing a play at the time, acting in a play with Chris Walken, who was in that movie and became sort of famous from that movie, won the Oscar for that movie. And there's a sequence in that movie built around Can't Take My Eyes Off You. The movie takes place in Pittsburgh's blue-collar steelworker town, begins on the eve of this group of friends about to ship out to Vietnam. And You Can't Take My Eyes Off You plays a very important part in that opening sequence of the film, The Deer Hunter. And I played that for Marshall, remembering it so vividly from 1979 when the movie was out. And I said, look, see, this is what's really fascinating about the music that these guys make. Look who's listening to it. It's these guys. It's not the footage that we see of the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, where you just see girls screaming. This is like guys, blue-collar guys, listening to songs written and performed by blue-collar guys. The guys in the movie look just like the guys in the group. This is music that speaks to an audience that doesn't come to the theater generally.
Right.
So, and I said, listen to the power of this song on those characters. They didn't pick this song randomly. This isn't underscore in a movie soundtrack that just plays under a montage. This is a scene built around that song and that Stan Kenton horn riff and those lyrics, and all the characters are singing the song along to the performance of the song, and that moved Marshall. That sort of hooked him, and so there we were at the back of the restaurant, and just to make the time pass, Bob and Frankie started telling us about the band and how they got together and what it was like to ride a rocket when they finally hit, and we asked them how come we'd never heard or read their story. And I mean, music fans know all about the Beatles and the Stones and the Dead and the Kinks and the Who, and all I knew about the Seasons was the music. Now, and all Marshall knew about the Seasons was the music. And when they told us that they were never really written about because they were these blue-collar guys without any glamour quotient, they didn't have long hair, they didn't have exotic accents, they didn't come from across the pond, they came from across the river. The Jersey being, the joke state. We got very, very interested and suggested that their untold story should be the show, not a Mamma Mia thing, which is to say a song list with a story retrofitted around the song list, but the story of these guys, with the songs as sort of a signposts along the way of that story, could be something amazing, because those movie posters that say based on a true story, what appealed to us instantly about these guys and everything they went through was the notion that we would very honestly be able to say based on a good story, and incidentally an untold story, so as would-be writers, an untold good story, okay, that had us leaning forward the same way the audience does when they watch the show. We were only behaving, the two of us, the way the audience would end up behaving when the show was on stage, because the story's really good and we don't know it yet. So sure that we have, oh, well, that this was the song you listened to the first time you went bowling, or this was the song you listened to when you were making out in the back of the car. This is the song you listened to when you went off to Vietnam. Great. But there was no universal context for those songs, or what the guys were doing when they made those songs, because that was an untold story. And we thought, as they started to spill it, one anecdote after another, it just seemed like the motherlode of good drama. There was conflict, there were villains, there were heroes, there was love, there was revenge, there was sex, there was death, everything that a good story should have.
Right.
So, so we said, why don't we do that? And they said, go ahead, knock yourself out. Write some pages, because we want to see what you guys are like as writers, a reasonable thing to say, because we don't want to be cartoons.
Sure.
And so Marshall and I wrote a treatment and we gave it to them, and they looked at it and they said, okay, all right, we'll let you guys be the writers. Now what do we do? Well, all the Broadway producers had all been my clients during my 20 years at the ad agency. So I said, well, we got to find, a producer. And they said, well, I said, what? But the guy who called me, they didn't want to be in business with the guy who called me, who had the option on their life story. So they said, let's wait until 2003 before we do anything else. This was,
Wow.
halfway through, or this was the summer of 2002. Let's wait. Because because then everything will be free and clear, and we can do whatever we want. And I thought, all right, well, this is never going to happen. Like I said to Marshall, well, we've only wasted our own time, but we had some fun. We got to hang out, Marshall and I, and it was great. I mean, it was fun for me. I hope it was fun for Marshall. I think it was. We just started kicking around an idea and doing that thing that writers do when they collaborate. And it was very exciting for me because I hadn't had that experience. And then I thought, okay, well, it's never going to happen. And right after New Year's in 2003, the phone rang and it was Gaudio calling from Nashville. And he said, okay, well, you said you know these Broadway producers, let's, how do you want to do it? So, I made appointments with people. I dragged Marshall along with me, and everybody looked at us like I was in that first phone call, like we were crazy. And the very last people we went to, not because I didn't love them, it's because they were having some issues, and it seemed like they were not people who were going to be thinking about pitches at that particular time. They were going through some business turmoil. And so I just thought, well, they'll never go for it. But everybody, at some point I said, all right, well, let's go to the Dodgers anyway, even if they just throw us out. And they got it. They just got it. They got it in terms of, oh, you mean they sold 125 million records, and you're telling us that their fans are guys and women who are now between 55 and 65 years old? Well, that's like everybody who goes to the theater. So okay, so we'll produce the show. But there was still no show. And then, okay, so who's going to direct this thing? And Des McAnuff had been a Dodger at one time, but Des McAnuff had also directed me in a musical that he wrote that we did down at the Public Theater for Joe Papp in 1982, called The Death of von Richthofen is Witnessed from Earth, about the Red Baron.
Oh, that was in his documentary.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was in that. So if you saw footage from that show, you saw me.
Wow.
Anyway,
Yes, Rick Elice is an actor. Yes.
So I knew Des. I knew Des from working for him as an actor. But then when I was in advertising, I did the advertising for Tommy, which Des directed, and Big River, which Des directed, and the revival of How to Succeed with Matthew Broderick that he directed. A Walk in the Woods. So it shows that he did that started at La Jolla. After he became artistic director of La Jolla Playhouse, and that came to Broadway, invariably were marketed by me. So Des was always on my radar. I certainly wasn't on his radar, but I remembered how much he wanted to be, like a rock and roll guy. So it seemed like he'd be the perfect person to ask. And then it turned out, which we didn't know, that Gaudio had spoken to Des like the year before about turning Peggy Sue Got Married into a musical.
Right. Uh-huh.
And so they actually knew each other. And so Des was like, Des said yes before we even finished asking the question. And it turned out, because luck is always a part of everything that works in the theater, he had a slot. This was now November or December of 2003. He had in August a slot at La Jolla had suddenly opened up. So he said to me and Marshall, I'll do this, but that means you have to write it now. And it's got to be ready by, the spring, because then we have to have auditions, and I've got to take it to designers and bid out sets and costumes and all that stuff so that there can be a production. And, but if you can pull that off, we'll go into rehearsal in the middle of August, and we'll open in October, and we'll play, for 6 weeks in La Jolla and see what happens. And so we said, okay, sure. And it was never about anything other than having the experience. I'm talking about me and Marshall. So it wasn't, well, we'll have to have our agent get in touch with your agent or any of that bullshit. It was, okay, this sounds like something that might be interesting to do. I had a full-time job during the day as creative consultant for the Walt Disney Studios. Marshall had lots and lots of irons in the fire going on. So we were trying to write this, after hours and on Saturday mornings and, whenever we could. And then in April of 2004, we had auditions. And sure enough, in August, we had rehearsals. But the very first time we ever heard the script, actually, there were no workshops, there were no readings, there were no music stands in sight. The very first time we heard the script out loud was the first day of rehearsals with the cast in the basement of a building at La Jolla Playhouse. It was the very first time we heard it, when it wasn't me and Marshall just reading it to each other. Right. Or to Des. So it doesn't usually happen that way, but because we didn't know, we didn't understand how unusual it was.
What was your and Marshall's partnership, writing partnership, like? For all the stuff you wrote together, like what was the give and take with, I'm going to write this scene, or I'm going to write this scene?
Well, Marshall, being somebody who understood, who had a history of collaboration, said, here's what's worked for me. Let's take really long walks and just talk about everything. We'll talk about what the story is. We'll talk about what has to happen in the scenes. We'll talk about what the characters are doing and thinking and feeling, and we'll walk until there's nothing else to do but write it. And then it'll write itself very easily.
Right.
And so that's what we did with Jersey Boys. We spent a lot of time talking and walking after spending a lot of time with the guys and interviewing them, which was interesting. Then we sort of hit the ground and walked through the park, and we would sit on park bench. We probably looked very strange. Not as strange as when I write alone now. I still do the same long walks in the park, but I'm talking to myself, which must look really, really strange.
Well, sometimes it's the best way to have a decent conversation.
Right. I know, it's so strange. I always heard that if you can talk, you can write. If you can write, you can talk, and that's.
Well, yeah, that sounds like a good thing. But I think also what you have to do to be able to write is you have to be a good listener.
Right.
100%.
Sometimes people are so busy talking that they don't know how to listen. The great writer Jane Wagner wrote a line for Lily Tomlin in a play called The Search for Signs of Intelligent Life in the Universe, where a woman is describing somebody and she says, he spoke with an intensity, he listened with an intensity that most people only have while speaking. And I remembered that line. I remember hearing that line in 1984 in the theater thinking, I think I better start listening more.
100%.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I
Active
think
listening.
I think it's you know, in terms of, you know, mine and Gia's partnership as well, I think it's a great reason why we both work very well together. We both listen to each other, you know, empathetically and actively, and it's so important.
Well, how do you know each other, the two of you?
Well, so we
Funny story.
yeah, we met we only met
We met
in
November.
2019, November
Right,
3rd,
November 3rd.
2019. I was living in Newark. She was
Before
living
your
in this,
birthday.
before
Happy
your
monthly birthday, by the way.
Yes, happy monthly
Yes.
birthday to Rick Elice. And
Oh, I see, because it's the 17th today.
exactly.
Oh, I
That's
get it. I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. I get it. You know, on May 17th, which is our half birthday, I mean, Bob Gaudio's and mine, that was the day that we got the August Wilson Theater, then the Virginia Theater. But it was May 17th.
May 17th.
And that we found out that we were indeed going to get a Broadway theater, because it was very, very touch and go for months, that there would be a place for us to play, because a theater had to be available at the time when Dez's calendar was available for him to be in New York directing the show and taking the show and getting it up. So it was not a fait accompli by any stretch of the imagination. And the window was tightening and tightening and tightening, and there was no real estate available. And we finally got the Virginia Theater, which was renamed the August Wilson Theater, whilst we were in the midst of previews. So that was May 17th, 2005. May 17th, exactly 1 year later, May 17th, 2006, was the day that former President Clinton came to see the show on Broadway.
Wow.
And came backstage and met everybody, and you know, that was exciting. When presidents and former presidents and first ladies and the Senate majority leaders and people like that are coming to see the show, you know that you've clicked into a different kind of hit.
Of course. Yeah.
It's like and then whoever else sits in those seats, they're like, oh yeah, these are the Clinton seats, or these are the Obama seats, you know.
He didn't come with Hillary. She was doing something, I guess, but he came with Chelsea.
Okay.
And Hillary saw the show later. But the day after the Tony Awards, the day after we won the Tony for Best Musical, from the party that Sunday night, the guys got on a bus and went down to the White House to perform for the current president, George W. Bush.
Right. Yes.
And
that's so cool.
Yeah, the heads of state were lining up.
Yeah.
It's like, and you know what they say, getting a musical to Broadway is like the Stations of the Cross.
The Stations.
I've heard that.
The Stations of the Cross. How did you come up with that pun?
That sounds like Marshall. That sounds too smart for me. It sounds too smart for me. But you have to always. There are a million things like that in the script. There's just a million specific things as opposed to
specific.
You have. That's just. I mean, that's part of the job of the writer is to be specific as possible. Sometimes because it helps the comedy. But what it always helps is as many bells as you can ring for the audience. And that's done through specificity. That's how you find commonality with the audience. Not, believe it or not with generality. Generality sounds like the logical way to appeal to the most people. But it's actually specificity that appeals to the most people.
It's like Bob Gaudio. It's like Bob Gaudio's monologue where when you're talking about the laws of physics and gravity.
Sure. That is a vintage Brickman speech. There's the laws of gravity speech. That's I remember the day he showed that to me, and I thought, well, this is very, very good. The other thing you have to be careful of doing, and this is something I learned from Marshall. I mean, certainly it was, writing Jersey Boys was a masterclass for me as a would-be writer. I'm very good with anger. I'm very good with agitation. I'm very good with fights because
The sit
you
down
know,
scene.
I'm very, very good with fights because I've played a lot of fights in my life. So I'm very sorry. So it's easy for me to summon that up. But it was such a masterclass for me working with Marshall on Jersey Boys. And the other thing that he taught me, and I think he may have said this about the law of gravity. He said, I said, gee, Marshall, that's great. He said, does it sound more like me than it sounds like Bob? And I said, what do you mean? He said, I, Marshall, never like when it sounds like you're hearing the author's voice, or his term is the hand of the author. He said, you never want to see the hand of the author because that's just not very crafty writing. You want the audience to think, to forget that this is something that exists on a page, that these are just words that are coming out of people's mouths in the moment. These people are just speaking to us. That's great writing. And so do you buy that this is something that the character of Bob Gaudio would say? And I said, yeah. Now it's not, I mean, he wasn't the question wasn't based on Bob's intelligence. It's because Bob's a supremely intelligent person, it's more to do with the metaphor of it. I mean, there's lots and lots of metaphorical writing. I think that it was after that conversation and listening to Marshall talking about metaphor that the crew scene happened where metaphor actually becomes part of the dialogue, because that was me sort of writing back to Marshall. Here, look what I learned, and I'm going to put it in the mouth of crew, who was the, sort of the teacher, and in that moment, where he is educating Tommy DeVito, who is all heat and instinct. He is educating him in that moment about the wider world. And one of the things he says is, it's a metaphor. I remember typing it in three, with 3 periods, and thinking this will be funny. And then of course, it always got a huge laugh.
Yes, well, that makes so much sense to me, because
it's really a tribute. It's really an inside tribute to Marshall Brickman.
That's beautiful, because that's what a collaboration really is. And when you were saying how you were acting as the journalist when Marshall talking to Frankie Valli and Bob Gaudio, when you said that this was guys would listen to this, it was Can't Take was for those people. They weren't trying to lift the Pentagon, and the people that were drawn to the band, were the girls in diners.
No, bear in mind that the Pentagon, the whole sort of merry pranksters aspect of left-wing liberal New York, over-educated, over-analyzed, over-privileged left-wing progressivism, as reflected in that movement at the end of the 60s, was diametrically different from the guys who were actually shipping out and going to Vietnam and fighting and dying for the country. And I was one of those. When I was a kid, I would be on a bus every Sunday to Washington, D.C. to protest the war in Vietnam. The guys who were buying the seasons records were the guys who went over and fought. And when they came back from fighting, they were disrespected. And, by the culture elite and by large swaths of society, because the Vietnam War was looked down on. And so therefore people who fought in it were looked down on as veterans. And, and the Four Seasons records, and the guys who bought those records were those guys. And so that speech, levitating the Pentagon and all that, those are specific reference. Those are buzzwords and buzz terms for those guys who didn't just talk a good game and protest. They were the ones who went over and defended the country with the best will in the world. You don't understand what that's like, what it would, when there was a draft and everyone was terrified of having to go to the other side of the world and fight for something we didn't really understand why. And a lot of people used their connections to not go. And a lot of people, went to Canada so that they didn't have to go. But a lot of people went because that's what you did. You went and you fought for your country, and they came back, and it was so that speech of Gordio's in that moment, that pre-dawn moment, is meant to be and has always been an edifying moment for those particular guys. And it was always very gratifying once audiences were coming to stand in the back of the house and see heads nodding, men's heads nodding, and you would know, okay, that's a vet there, that's a guy who went over, that's a guy who went over, that's a guy who went over. The guys who went over, as described in that speech, the guys flipping burgers and pumping gas, the guys who went over and fought and came back.
Right.
So the levitating the Pentagon was really sort of to demonstrate to those guys that this music was created for them and that this show loves them, and finally they could get the respect that eluded them at the end of the 60s and the early 70s.
That's beautiful.
Thank you for doing that. And by doing that, you're teaching the younger generation, like David and me, that's what happened, and that's the history through music.
Well, and it was because I was teaching myself. I was so smug, coming out of how I grew up and what the politics in my family were. And I dare say this was true of Marshall too, who we both sort of New York lefties, and so we thought we knew better. And by getting to know Bob and Frankie and the music and their lives, we encountered this thing that's really important to make yourself into a fully rounded human being, which is called humility. That
Yes.
we weren't such hot shit. And a lot of people were disrespected, and if not that they were owed anything, but if we could tip our hat to them in the show, it would be humble to do it.
Yeah.
And that's why we did it. It was a good thing for them, and it was a good thing for us as men to do that for them.
Right. And how special that you wrote like that part of history in the dialogue for Bob specifically. Like you gave those words to the man who wrote the lyrics that related to all of those people. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, Bob was very, Bob was very, very proud as a songwriter in the 60s and as a kid. I mean, younger than either of you, believe it or not. I mean, bear in mind, when the Beatles had 3 songs in the top 5 or whatever it was, and the other 2 songs were written by Bob Gaudio. He was younger than the 2 of you are right now.
Wow.
And so that Bob Gaudio and the Bob Gaudio who 40 years later was telling us what it was like to be in the top 5 with the Beatles, was kind of a great, who do you know? Who do you know who's had songs in the top 5 with the Beatles? This guy. I mean, this is the guy who did it. He wrote those songs, and sold those records, and there was no magic to it. He just had the gift of the hook.
Yep.
This kid, Bob Gaudio, and so it's it was lovely to be able to give him that tribute moment to give the character that moment in the show as a tribute to the real man sitting in the audience watching it.
Right. Yeah. So and he's saying it as essentially, and Crew, and I love how you said that Crew was the teacher, and he is the one who actually told everyone point blank it's a metaphor, because he needs to be the one. Because as a young would-be writer, hopefully, we're always told to show and not tell. But sometimes you need a character to just tell you what's going on. And that's Bob Crew.
Well, he gives them the most important advice in the show. He says, go out and find, figure out who you are. Mm-hmm. Figure out what your voice is. Figure out what your identity is. You have an identity crisis, he says to them. That's why your bands had 45 different names. Go out and figure out figure out who you are. And once you figure out who you are, you'll figure out a sound for yourselves. Mm-hmm. And that rung a bell for young Bob Gaudio, because otherwise they were covering other people's songs, as we depict in the show. They had an interesting sound, people were confused what it was. Is it 4 guys? Is 3 guys and a girl? Is it a black group? Nobody really understood the 4 seasons from the records. But they, when they were covering songs, and then Gaudio went off and wrote these, the first spate of songs for them to sing that would be their own songs. But that happened really because Bob Cruz said, you need to figure out who you are.
Right.
Important. It sounds easy, but he was the, what you would call in writing the inciting incident is Bob Cruz saying, go out and figure out who you are and then come back to me. And then they come back to him, and then he does the next sort of heroic thing, which is he comes up with the money to make those first recordings.
Right. The insane.
Otherwise, who knows? Of course, Tommy said he would come up with the money, but he didn't come up with the money.
Right.
Or he came up with the money, but he also took a lot of money, for other purposes, and got himself into a hole that would come back and haunt the band, years later. So, Crew in Act 1 of the show is sort of the heroic character, and then the mob boss Gyp DeCarlo in Act 2 becomes the fixer for the group. He was a very complicated real life person who did a lot of questionable things, shall we say.
Right.
But in our show, what he does is he figures out a way to keep all 4 of them alive. And
wow.
Yeah. So in terms of the history of the 4 seasons, Gyp DeCarlo is sort of heroic too.
Would you say the girls are also anchors of the show? Because
sure. I mean, when you have 3 actors playing 46 roles,
of course.
what that does is for the actor, it becomes a great chance to show off, and that's always a fun thing for actors to do. So those women would invariably would stay a long time in the show because it's fun to show off that way.
Of course.
And they all got to demonstrate
how good
a very broad skill set, I think.
Well, just the characters, because Mary would say to Frankie, it's like, yeah, I spent 2 days in the hospital because of that shit. Or Lorraine telling, oh, St. Francis, kind to animals. Like, it feels like all the girls are telling Frankie, like, get your shit together. So, and Frankie needs that guidance. So would you say that?
Well, you need also in a story that's principally about the 4 seasons, who are 4 men.
Right.
You need to have women and wives, mothers, lovers, children of the female gender play a very significant role in the lives of the 4 seasons. So it was important to have many female characters, but it was also important to have a show with a cast that was small enough so that we could actually get the show on without it costing millions and millions of dollars. So, as a former actor, I loved the idea of writing lots and lots of parts for those 3 actors.
Ron Melrose told us that he utilized Dawn in specific sections in the underscoring in Act 2 to illustrate Frankie's illusion that he would never be good enough for Lorraine. And of course, when Frankie and Lorraine break up, Dawn is playing in the underscore, and it's also playing when they meet. Well, 2 songs are playing when they meet. It starts with Silence is Gold, and then it goes into Dawn. So we always wondered if Lorraine's name was originally
Ron is witty as hell when it comes to underscore.
Yeah.
The way he matched up the scenes with the idea of the lyrical content of those songs is pretty spectacular. In Jersey Boys, it's one of the great unsung things that's a funny joke, isn't it? One of the great unsung elements is the underscore, because A is literally unsung, but B it's really quite brilliant what Ron did, because it demonstrates how in tune he is. I worked on another show with Ron for 2 years that never made it to New York, but by then I knew him, you know, so I wasn't embarrassed to just like stare at him, figure these things out. He's very, very clever. Anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, it's totally okay. But so we always wondered if Lorraine's name was originally Dawn in the script.
No.
No.
No. Okay.
No. Would you like a longer answer? There was
Sure.
Lorraine. There was a real life character who was represented in the show that I can't really tell you about because it would irritate some people. So we were asked, Marshall and I were asked to eliminate that character. And we really didn't want to do it because it was really important to the second act of our show. And Des really didn't want to do it because it was, you know, it was good stuff, really, really good stuff. And, you know, it was, you know, we're just the writers. These are lives that are actually led by people, you know, and they were all still alive. And, you know, so we needed to, after protesting and trying to negotiate a different outcome, we said, okay, well, you know, if the answer is absolutely no, and there's no room for negotiation here, we obviously will need to create something else. So we created the character of Lorraine, based very, very loosely on a woman named Lorraine that Marshall and I both know, who was a reporter for the Detroit Free Press back in the day that we knew had interviewed Frankie Valli.
Okay.
And so we created the character. She's named Lorraine in honor of the woman who knows she's aware that we did that. It's not really so important that anybody else know, but she was never called Dawn, no. No,
Okay.
in fact, we absolutely did not want to do that. We never wanted to have a character named Sherry, and we never wanted to have a character named Marlena. We never wanted to have a character named Dawn or anything like that because it just seemed so kind of cheesy to do that.
Right.
And unless that were the case, but I mean it wasn't like Frankie ever dated a girl named Sherry, and so Gaudio wrote a song about Sherry. The closest that you would come to it being the case would be Ragdoll, which was, Bob was stopped on 9th Avenue, I think, down around Penn Station one day in his car, and a homeless girl came over to, you know, clean his windshield. And she looked like such a ragamuffin that he went up to crew and said, I have an idea for a song. I want to call it Ragdoll because of this homeless girl who was just trying to clean my windshield. That's the closest of like, oh, okay, I'm going to write about what I saw.
Right. That's fascinating.
But there were all those girls' names, the girl songs, as we call them, was a sequence in the show at one point.
Right.
There was a time where the Seasons went to perform at a drive-in, and they lost the power. And the fans turned the car headlights on so that they could continue with the concert. And they did an acoustic concert for the fans, lit by the headlights of the cars at the drive-in. And we thought that was such a cool theatrical thing to create for the stage. And we decided for that section what they were going to sing was it's four guys on the road, and they've left their wives and girlfriends behind. They're on the road, and they're meeting a lot of girls, and every girl has a name, and every name has a song. And it was all these songs that Gaudio and crew wrote, Connie and Ronnie and Marlena, and they did this medley. And that's why there are those cars in the set of Jersey Boys, the three Cadillacs with the headlights. When we realized that the first act was too long, we took that section out, but the cars had already been built. So Des said, write a scene where we can, use the cars.
I do have a question. Because you didn't want it to be cheesy. This was the story. And sometimes cheesiness can be associated with the term jukebox musical. So would you consider Jersey Boys a jukebox musical or a bio musical? What term do you want people to use?
Well, it's funny. You should ask. The jukeboxes what the critics started calling jukebox musicals with Mamma Mia
Right.
had been around longer than there were jukeboxes. Jukeboxes didn't come around until 1937, 1938, around then. You know, the Ziegfeld Follies really were musical reviews that would take popular songs of the day and repurpose them in a different show. The George White Scandals of the 20s did the same thing. Irving Berlin built the Music Box Theater, still there on 45th Street, specifically to house the Music Box reviews, because he was his own publisher, and he made his money by selling sheet music for his songs. And his shows would run for 3 months, and then no one would hear the songs anymore. And so his sales would go down, and he said, I hate this, you know, I want to sell more sheet music. So he would take songs from shows that had closed and put them in new shows, and they would be put on at the Music Box Theater that he built specifically for this purpose. Then and it worked.
Yeah.
And then he thought, well, you know how to really make it work? Is to do it in a movie. So he went out to Hollywood, and he did a movie called Holiday Inn, which was taking all these songs that he'd written for specific holidays and putting them in one thing. It was a jukebox musical. Of course, nobody called it a jukebox musical. And that form was born. Everyone's favorite movie musical of all time, Singin' in the Rain.
Right.
Arthur Freed, the producer of the movie, was a songwriter with Herb Nuncio Brown. And he had all these trunk songs from the 20s and 30s. And L.B. Mayer said, do a movie musical where we don't have to pay for any new music. And so he said, I got this great trunk full of songs called Betty Comden, Adolph Green. Come on out here. Gene Kelly, Stanley Donen, the directors. We're gonna do a movie called Singin' in the Rain. It can be about whatever you want it to be about. It's got to have these songs in it, including this one called Singin' in the Rain. And Betty Comden famously said, so, you know, we went home and we thought, okay, well, there's going to be singing and it's going to be raining. And we sort of went forward from there. But it's a jukebox musical. You know, in 1978, maybe, I think, or 1978, Ain't Misbehavin', which was,
yes.
The songs of Fats Waller, won the Tony Award for Best Musical. In 1983, there was a musical called My One and Only, which was a Gershwin jukebox musical, right? There was Tommy Tune and Peter Stone and Mike Nichols and Twiggy and Tony Walton and various other people took their pick of Gershwin songs and organized a show based around it. That was 1983. 1992, Crazy for You won the Tony Award for Best Musical. Was the same thing. It was
so true.
A jukebox musical, but the jukebox that they went to was Gershwin specific. That was 1992. In 1999, the Best Musical Tony went to Fosse, which was a jukebox musical of Fosse's numbers that he had done, not just songs, but actual entire pieces of choreography. Jerome Robbins' Broadway in 1989, 10 years before that, a jukebox musical of moments of musicals. One could argue, in fact, that if you do a revival of Oklahoma, you are going to see it, to hear people will say we're in love and Surrey with the Fringe on top and the farmer and the cowboy should be friends, etc. Because you're not going to find out who Laurie's going to take to the box lunch. You're going because you want to hear those songs. And so in effect, these great old musicals that people go to because they love the songs, those are jukebox musicals now. Two, you go to see Hamlet. You go to see Hamlet to hear how is David going to say to be or not to be. That is the question. What's he going to do with that? What's he going to do with that soliloquy that I'm never going to have heard before? So in effect, even Hamlet is a jukebox musical.
So that's called the jukebox. That's called the jukebox David.
So my point being that because the critics wanted something to be pejorative about, they created what they called the jukebox musical as a pejorative term for people who had a paucity of imagination and were just going to stand on the shoulders of popular music to sell tickets. Well, okay, you know, if you put Hugh Jackman in The Music Man, you're standing on the shoulders of Hugh Jackman to sell tickets. If you could put Barbra Streisand in Funny Girl, you're standing on the shoulders of Barbra Streisand. If you put Tom Cruise in a play, or Nicole Kidman in a play, or Meryl Streep in a play, you're standing on the shoulders of those people to sell tickets. So why not stand on the shoulders of music? Back in the day, if you had a Rodgers and Hammerstein show, you were standing on their shoulders to sell tickets. If Andrew Lloyd Webber does a musical, you're standing on his. If Lin Miranda does a musical, you're standing on his shoulders. So what is exactly is pejorative? It's a little like walking into a museum and saying, "Oh God, not another rectangular painting." You know, I mean, who cares?
Right.
Who cares what the shape of the frame is? It's what's inside the frame that's important. So are there hilarious comedies where you fall out of your chair laughing? Of course. Are there comedies that just lay an egg and nobody laughs? Sadly, yes. Are there great movies about World War II that make you weep with patriotism? Yes, of course. Are there war movies that bore you to tears? Yes, that's true. Are there jukebox musicals that are thrilling to watch and that make you thank God for the day you were born? Yes, there are. Are there ones that fall short of that? Yes, that's also true. But just in and of itself, the genre does not mean that you don't deserve, oxygen.
Right.
And it's just kind of this the genreization of the theater or any art form is just really short-sighted, because it's got nothing to do with what's on the stage. It's only got to do with somebody's idea of what's acceptable or not acceptable. And, fuck you. Don't tell me what's acceptable or what's not acceptable. We're the ones who are doing all the work. We're going to try to make something great. If it falls short, the people who are going to pay for it are us. It will be our time and our effort and our treasure that we have spent. But of course we're trying to do something wonderful. Nobody tries to do a bad show.
Exactly. Right. Unless
anyway, that's my speech about jukebox
Thank
musicals.
you.
Salud. Thank you for the history of jukebox musicals and the genre, because it's ridiculous.
So Jersey Boys, within that genre, Jersey Boys decided, okay, we're going to do a musical biography. Now, and of course, because Jersey Boys was successful, there have been many, many musical biography shows since then, because people tend to do something that's like the last thing that was a big hit. But we made the decision based on the lives that these guys had led and the sort of crazy ass stuff that they had been through. and that it happens if they had made automobile tires or pharmaceuticals instead of songs, it might have been a less interesting show. The thing that they made turned out to be the thing that makes musical theater exist. So it seemed like a inevitable decision. I'd like to say, oh well, we were brilliant, but we weren't brilliant. We just did the thing that seemed impossible not to do.
Right. You did what was right for the story and what made sense. And it just kills me though, like with all of the coverage out there, and it's a jukebox musical. It's like, but because they don't take the time to research and know what you know about the history of this genre. People just need to get over themselves with.
After that, it became adaptations. Adaptation. When Jersey Boys was successful, they left jukebox musicals alone for a while, and they went into adaptations. Oh, everything's adapted from something. Well,
right.
Yeah, everything's adapted from something. Most things are. Guess what? So's Romeo and Juliet, adapted from something. Shakespeare. Really? It was a very popular story, and Shakespeare went, oh, it's a popular story. I think I'm going to tell my version of it. Adaptation, Oedipus, which is thousands of years old. There were how many versions of Oedipus are? Everyone had an Oedipus. It's what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed, is a line from a poem by Alexander Pope, I think, an essay on criticism. But I mean, that's it. There's 88 keys on the piano. There's a certain number of stories that people love. You do it the way you want to do. And if you can tell it in a way that nobody's thought of telling it before, or in a way that hits home better, or makes people's, hair stand up on the back of their neck, good for you. And then people always remember your Romeo and Juliet. 400 years after Shakespeare did that, look what happened. Jerome Robbins did West Side Story, did it again. It's, it's not important who invented the story. It's important to who tells it in a great way.
Right.
That's at least as important. So, they went off, the critics went off on a tear about adaptations as if that was a bad thing or had never happened until 2008.
Right.
Of course, but of course it's always happened. It's harder, in fact, to name completely original Broadway musicals. Can you name a Broadway musical that's not based on anything, that's not adapted from anything? Can you do it?
What about?
With Dear Evan Hansen.
No.
Dear Evan Hansen. Dear Evan Hansen is a great example.
Bandstand.
In and of itself, adaptation is no more an indication of superior or inferior work than using pre-existing music it means it has to be inferior work. It depends on what's on the stage, not what the genre is.
I love this story. I think that a lot of young people too, because like that who are listening to our show right now, thank you, is that just take things for as they are and enjoy the actual story, because a lot of the time, especially with social media and everything is just so out there, we take a lot of things out of context. And we've been thinking about this with the family is everything line that you and Marshall Brickman wrote. So but think about where that line came from in the show, right? So family is everything, and it's talking about how, are you kidding? Family is everything, but it's because he's cheating on his wife on the road, and that's where the gravity monologue comes in, and people forget about what's surrounding that line. The same way in other movies, when you think of, like, for example, for me, when I think of You're Killing Me, Smalls, when I go back and rewatch The Sandlot, to me, that's not a very crazy delivered line. It's just like a whatever line that people put out into and made it huge. Or when you think of the Berenstain Bears or Jif with one effort.
The Mandela effect.
Yes, David mentioned this earlier. We have that Mandela effect for too many things today, because people
Tell
me what you mean by Mandela effect.
So the Mandela effect is literally everyone remembers it how they need to. It's
literally.
like it's like the peanut butter company Jif.
Oh, sure, yeah.
How is it spelled?
I thought you were talking about GIF. Those repeated.
That's what I thought too.
I thought that's what you were referring to. The peanut butter had one F.
One F, exactly.
One F,
and the is it the Berenstain Bears or Berenstein Bears?
Berenstein, yeah. I always thought it was Berenstein. Am I wrong?
I actually don't know.
Bears.
But
yes, we have those things in life a lot where we think that we're right and we're not. And even like Luke, I am your father.
William Safire, who used to write a column for the New York Times after he was a speechwriter for Richard Nixon, who was an American president in the 60s and 70s.
Never heard of him.
There used to be a word. There still is a word called Forte, and most people pronounce it forte, right. But the actual pronunciation is fort. And William Safire, and I never knew what to do, because I knew that people said forte, but I knew that the correct pronunciation was fort. Right. And I also knew that if I said fort in a conversation, it would be assumed that I was wrong, even though I was correct. Mm-hmm. So I didn't know what to do. And William Safire had a column in the Sunday Times Magazine section called On Language. So I wrote a letter into the column, and I said, I had this dilemma. I don't want people to think I'm stupid when in fact I'm being accurate. Right. How do you, if more people mispronounce a word than pronounce it, who's right? And he wrote back and he said, it's a fascinating issue, isn't it? And which is why I now say, after a certain period of time, and the Oxford English Dictionary does this too now, after a certain period of time, a mispronunciation becomes acceptable because so many people are using it that in fact it becomes correct. Mm-hmm. And so both are permitted. You can say fort, you can say forte, but there was a time when people were just wrong, and right. and the people who were right sounded wrong.
Right,
it's
and
like,
that's why
who's to say?
Exactly, right. And the beauty of the theater with dramatic writing and comedic writing, and specifically Jersey Boys, is that you have different versions. And that's it. You have to just take it for how this person is presenting the information. Well,
there was a period of time where Marshall and I were trying to assess who to actually believe. And then one day we were at Marshall's apartment, and we were on two separate telephones talking to Tommy DeVito from Las Vegas. You know, the late Tommy DeVito, who passed away in September from COVID at the age of, I think, 93. You know, he's no longer with us. And Joe Saravo, an actor who played in the show for 2,000 performances, playing Gyp DeCarlo, passed away a week ago. You know, that's the show. If the show's around long enough, there are joyful moments, you know, people who get together, romances, marriages, children. But then there's also the other side of it, which is, you know, people start to fall off the twig, and it's, you know, so it's just something I like to mention.
Thank you very much.
But Tommy DeVito, you know, we finally got him on the phone, and we had talked to Frankie and Bob a lot, and we'd heard Bob's version of X, and we heard Frankie's version of X, and then sometimes Frankie would have a different version of X, and sometimes Bob would have 3 different versions of X, and we were, you know, we thought, how are we ever going to know? And we got Tommy DeVito on the phone, and he said, "Don't listen to those guys. I'll tell you what really happened." And from across the room on our 2 different telephones, we looked up at each other, and it was like, eureka! That was the light bulb moment. It was like, oh, I see. They're all going to say that they're all right. And that's why the line originally was, yes, 4 guys, you get 17 different versions. You know,
Really? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think I seem to recall that Des asked us to, or maybe one of the actors said, you know, somebody came to see the show and was confused by that, so we made it a more modest statement of, yes, 4 guys, you get 4 different versions, which is obviously true from once you've seen the show. And it didn't mess up the Rashomon idea, but the Rashomon idea came from that, hearing Tommy DeVito say
Eureka.
No.
We
said Eureka. Tommy DeVito said, "I'll tell you what really happened." The idea of oh, well, that's actually that will, if they all feel that way, then that gives us the luxury as writers of, you know, of recognizing that, and then letting the audience decide for themselves. And that was a big idea. And I think it's integral to the success of the show. That, yes, it's great to have, you know, usually when there's direct address in a show, that's the character that the audience has a privileged relationship with. Like we were talking about Richard III earlier. When Richard III speaks to us directly, look, I'm this terrible asshole, but you don't even know the half of it. Look, here's what I'm going to do. Watch this. You're not going to believe this. The audience is immediately on that character's side. That's what I mean by a privileged relationship. We assume that everything that character tells us is true, because why would he lie? You know, it's like, what's the point of lying to the people who are watching your story? If you want them to believe in you, then you should be telling them the truth. The idea of an undependable narrative voice is really, really useful in Jersey Boys, because we don't know it's undependable. There are clues. I mean, right off the top, when Tommy steps forward and says, "We put Jersey on the map." Well, you know, you could argue, well, yeah, maybe Frank Sinatra put Jersey on the map, or maybe Bruce Springsteen put Jersey on the map. You know,
thank you.
I mean, you know, maybe Thomas Edison put Jersey on the map. You know, there are
Whitney Houston, Jonas Brothers, Bon Jovi.
So we establish, I think, I don't want to sound ubiquitous or anything. You know, we establish right off the bat that Tommy is a bullshit artist. He's an enchanting bullshit artist, but he's a bullshit artist. And that means that you take everything he says with a grain of salt. Right. Now, still don't think the audience understands that. While Tommy is narrating the first section of this show, Spring. But when Bob appears and says, "Look, it's not like I sprung to life fully formed. You know, the day that Tommy DeVito, you know, that Joe Pesci rang my doorbell, sent by Tommy DeVito." So everything that you've just heard Tommy DeVito say, that's not actually that's Bob Gaudio's character's way of saying, "Don't listen to him. I'll tell you what really happened." Right. Then when fall begins, what's the first thing that Nick says? "Oh, you know, Bob was so busy thinking about the future, he couldn't see what was happening right under his nose."
Right.
And we go back, we flash back in the forward motion of the story to go back and build back up to the time where Norm Waxman comes and says, you know, we need to figure out what's going to happen. He owes us $150,000, which sort of breaks the rule, the narrative rule of the show, which is always, you know, we're starting here and we're going to move forward in the story. But Nick's section takes us back and replays a sort of a replay from a completely different point of view of what's happening to get us back to the Norm Waxman thing and, you know, into the sit down, so that we understand where the band is, which is Nick's way of demonstrating that what Bob was telling us about, which is the success and all of the records and everything, that was just part of the story. And then as soon as Frankie takes over, he really just asks lots and lots of questions. So he doesn't have the definitive narrative perspective either. So the unreliable narrator was turned out to be a really, really interesting device for Jersey Boys, mostly because it makes it a more interactive experience for the audience, right? So if you like Tommy DeVito's character, you're more liable to believe everything he says. But if you're crushing on Bob Gaudio, then you're going to believe everything he says. And if you think Nick Massey's dreamy, you're going to believe everything he says. And if you're like the rest of the world, you know, this huge Frankie Valli fan, you're going to take what the other three say with a grain of salt, and you're going to really listen to Frankie. And there is no absolute truth, and that makes it a more engaging experience, I think, for the audience.
I think it's time to write a Passover Haggadah and cast the four sons as the four seasons. It's like how in Fiddler on the Roof, where they're all in the town square, and the rabbi's son goes, he's right, they can't both
How
be
can
right.
they both be right?
And
You know
Tevye
what?
says,
You're
you know
also
what?
right.
You're also right.
He's
He's a little wet behind the ears, Reb Tevye.
Exactly. Well, and this also goes to what David actually mentioned months ago when we were doing our brain dump just to get ready for this podcast. It sounds maybe like very similar to how you and Marshall Brickman would just walk around the park and just talk and just think about everything. David mentioned how Frankie's whole winter section, he never talks about himself. He's always talking about what everybody else said and how he misses Nick and how Tommy did his thing, but he still took us here, so it's so interesting to see that that's how Frankie told his part of the story, because he's the guy who's at the front, but he doesn't have to, I don't know, that's just Frankie.
He's the humble upfront guy.
Kind of, yeah. And then, and Rick, with the way you and Marshall set this whole thing up is a writer's dream and an audience's ideal show, at least for me. I'm very biased because you have flashbacks, you have direct addresses. For any person who loves Italian American mob movies, Scorsese movies, you have both of those, So
and I'll tell you something for me that's cool.
Yeah.
No, something for me that's cool is having dialogue weaving in and out of the music. Right. I love when that happens and when that's done so effectively.
It's delicious.
Yeah.
Well, that's Ron and that's Ron and Des.
Mm-hmm.
Des, who was, who created Jersey Boys really at the top of his powers, really the top of anybody's powers. It's such a spectacular piece of work on Des's behalf, Jersey Boys, which never really stops moving, and the direct address sections, mm-hmm. which Des coined a term which I use all the time now, the book over, which is a way to get from here to there. The narration really is sort of a cheat in drama because it is the opposite of show, not tell. It's tell.
Right, but it's so good.
And so it's frowned upon by dramatists because it's a cheat. Once upon a time, it's good, it's storytelling, but it's not theatrical because it's telling and not showing.
Right.
However, in Jersey Boys, Des had an idea of what the pace of the show was going to be always in his head, and Des is an impatient person as a director, and so the show has an impatience to it that I love because I too am an impatient person, and so is Marshall. We both, Marshall and I, it turns out, as writers, and Des as a director, have sort of we're in double time generally. Mm-hmm. As right. men and as theater workers. So it was a good marriage, the three of us, in terms of tone and pace, I don't mean speed. Speed is different from pace, but in terms of tone and pace, we heard the show in a similar way. When Ron came on, and he probably talked to you about this, you know, the Des built-in places in the show that don't usually exist in a musical. What usually exists are safeties in you know, and vamps,
right.
where you know, an actor, if an actor's getting more laughs than usual, or fewer laughs than usual, or more applause than usual, or no applause at all, or forget something, the conductor can skip to a safety, or can cue an orchestra out of a safety into the musical meat of the scene based on what's happening that night that might be happening in a completely different way tomorrow and it happened in a different way yesterday. Yeah. And there are some safeties in Jersey Boys, but there are also very, very specific underscore sections that do not have safeties that would begin or end with hydraulic things moving in the set or whatever. So actors knew that you did not have the option to stretch it out, to milk a line, to slow down the tempo of the show, to play the audience, which, you know, sometimes actors do. But to keep the show moving at the tempo that Des wanted it at, that he rehearsed it at, and he would rehearse indefatigably with the actors running scenes until it was at the tempo he wanted. And then Ron would create underscore specifically for that amount of time so that the actors never had the luxury of stretching. And that's why when the show runs now, it's exactly the same length as it was 15 years ago when it started. And it's very hard to find shows that's the case, long run shows that don't get longer and longer and longer, because that's just the natural entropy of performance, is that you start milking things, you know, because things become precious to you in repetition. But in Jersey Boys, that was it's never an option because of the way Des and Ron constructed the show and the underscore that girds the event from the minute that it starts till the end. With the narrations, and Des used narrations that way too. Sometimes we would get rid of a scene, and Des would say, we can do this in 5 lines. Do this in 5 lines, and we'll do it as a narration. We'll do it as a book over to get us from here to there, so that we never had to have a meanwhile moment. We never had to have a meanwhile while, you know, we were at the bowling alley. A funny thing was happening back at home. We never had to do that. We had the book over instead. And as useful as it is to Jersey Boys, and as integral as it is to Jersey Boys, Marshall and I got a lot of criticism because it's a dramatic cheat, because it's tell and not show. I'm not sorry, but you know, these days when I'm writing, sometimes I think, oh God, you know what would be really handy here is a book over.
Yeah, but that's your facility as an editor, right? Because you know exactly where to fit things in and how you.
Well, yeah, but before I edit, I write. I overwrite terribly. You know, in that sort of carpenter rule of, you can always make something more concise,
right?
But you don't want to have to actually pad things once you get it into a muscular shape. You don't want to necessarily have to pad things. Sometimes you do, because there are things happening in a theater piece that the audience isn't aware of, that because it's not something that they see, but there's some reason backstage or under the stage or over the stage where somebody needs more time to accomplish something. So occasionally you are asked to provide more time, so that something can happen. And the audience goes, unfortunately, why is this scene so long? But that never happens in Jersey Boys, because Des from day one, Des had like a tempo in his head, and he never varied from it. And it's one of the reasons why Jersey Boys is such a bright and alive show. When I'm working alone, I don't usually work from an outline. I don't usually work from a beat sheet, but I always have an idea of what has to happen and in what order.
Okay.
But when I'm collaborating with another book writer, or I'm collaborating with a composer lyricist, when there's more than me in a room, you know, index cards, or you know, some whatever version you want to talk about of those are important, so that everybody's always on the same page, and that you can also very simply experiment once you get very familiar with what those cards represent. It's you can experiment with structure.
Yeah.
And and Marshall, Des, and I spent a lot of time with a lot of index cards.
Yes, that's what I was wondering, how
Jersey
you would
Boys.
set everything up.
Yeah. I mean, we, and in a lot of different places. And there were some times where we actually had giant bulletin boards moved from one place to another because of, whatever reason we had to be one place or another. But we did spend a lot of time with index cards and shifting and moving things around because at that stage you can do it and it doesn't cost anything. If you start moving things around when the show is on stage, it becomes very, very expensive to do that.
Right.
And therefore very, very inefficient. So you want to start rehearsal with what feels at the time as the best possible order of the show, best possible shape of the scenes, best possible muscularity of the script.
Yeah.
Because there are a million things that you can't anticipate that are going to happen once you start rehearsals.
You told us that somebody told you this, like from your writing from Jersey Boys to Peter and the Starcatcher, no one can tell that, like, it's like, oh, the guy from Jersey Boys wrote this. They don't know, like, who knew.
Well, that's my little vanity. I just to contextualize it, what I was saying to you was, I'm not, Marshall's a great writer, Aaron Sorkin, Lynn, Miranda, Terrence McNally, the Lynn Nottage, Tony Kushner, the Chekhov, Shakespeare. There are Tom Stoppard. There are great writers, yes. Which is how I know I'm not one. Greatness is a distinction, and I don't think people should, claim that mantle too easily. So I thought, okay, well, what if I'm going to write? What kind of a writer am I going to try to be? I was middle-aged by the time I started this gig. So I thought, well, what am I going to be like if I ever get a chance to do it again? And I thought, and eventually I started thinking about what my voice was. What was my voice going to be as a writer? If you go to see a Woody Allen movie, it's hard.
You know who it is. Yeah.
You may not know what movie it is, but you always know it's a Woody Allen movie.
Exactly.
They sound like Woody Allen movies. They feel like Woody Allen movies. But I don't think it's necessarily true of other writers. And I thought, okay, it's like actors. There are personality actors, stars. And they tend to be, they can be great, but they're usually playing themselves. Robert Redford, for example. Then there are the actors like Dustin Hoffman. Who are character actors. Like you see him in The Graduate, and then you see him in
Lenny.
Midnight Cowboy, and then you see him in Lenny, and then you see him in Little Big Man. You think, that's the same guy? That's like amazing. The difference is he had to do that because of the way he looked. If he looked like Robert Redford, maybe he would have done it another way. But I thought, okay, so what kind of I'm not a Robert Redford kind of a writer, because I'm not beautiful and great. I'm more of a Dustin Hoffman kind of a writer, which is, I want to be different.
Yeah.
So I thought, I'm going to make that my goal. Yes. I'm going to try always to write something and not have somebody go, oh, this must be written by that guy who did the other thing. And to choose opportunities that would allow me to do that. So, Ron Melrose and I spent 2 years working on a show called Superfly for the legendary Bill T. Jones. Mm-hmm. And at the end of that, I think I said this to you the other day, one of the cast members, was a group entirely of actors of color and with one or two, Ron and I were, sort of like the white guys in that group. And one of the actors brought his parents over after we presented it, and they said, "You're the writer?" And I was so delighted, because they couldn't quite believe that it just sounded so quote unquote authentic, which is different from actual authenticity, right? Jersey Boys is a good example of what I mean by that.
Yes.
The songs in Jersey Boys are presented in ways that feel authentic to the way we remember the records. Mm-hmm. But if you put them up against the original records, you hear that they're actually they're actually quite different.
Oh,
big time.
Oh my gosh.
So if
Yes.
if we aimed for actual authenticity,
Right.
it might not have been as effective as what we did with Bob Gaudio and Steve Kennedy and Ron Melrose and the music department. Steve Orich, of course, but Steve Orich's orchestrations, which sound like, oh, that's like the original record. And then you hear the original record and you go, oh no, that's not the original record at all.
Mm-hmm.
The, you know, these guys, Steve and Ron and Steve Kennedy and Gaudio, of course, supervising the whole thing, figured out they just made this decision that they were going to present Jersey Boys in a way that felt authentic, not actually was authentic, because what the audience wanted to, what would give the audience the best time was something that felt authentic, and don't get too hung up on what actually happened. Aaron Sorkin famously said,
Yes.
you know, when he was writing The Social Network, and people were complaining that the real life Mark Zuckerberg wasn't exactly like the character that he wrote in that movie. He said, well, you know, art isn't about what actually happened. Art is what writers do with what happened to tell a great story. That's true. And Jersey Boys isn't a documentary, and the music in Jersey Boys is not meant to be a document of the original records, but it feels authentic. I'm writing Princess Bride now with Bob Martin of Slings and Arrows fame and Drowsy Chaperone, of course, The Prom, you know, and like collaborating with Marshall, Bob's a much better writer than I am. I mean, he's very scholarly about it, as well as being hilarious. He understands about writing so well, and I think, okay, well, and we definitely do, okay, like, okay, you're going to do this scene and you're going to do this scene, and then, you know, that's how we move forward. We sort of leapfrog over each other. And that's how we're working. But when I'm writing, I am trying to write invisibly, which is to say, I would like the audience to come to see Princess Bride and go, oh, well, really what this does is this sounds like a musical that William Goldman, who wrote the novel and wrote the screenplay of the movie and was one of the great writers of the 20th century. This must have been written by William Goldman. And, you know, so we are making a conscious effort to write in the style of a third person, not in either of our styles. And then Bob and I are also doing something else. And that isn't written in any particular, that doesn't exist in a particular style. So there, I'm just trying to make it seem as if Bob's written the whole thing, because, you know, or one person, it's
right,
there's
one
voice.
Right.
There's one voice. And his particular comedy, which makes me laugh, is much, you know, is thrilling for me, because I don't have that gift. I'm not.
You are a comedic writer.
Well, Marshall makes the distinction between jokes and laughs. You know,
Okay.
I can't write jokes. Writing jokes is a very, very particular skill, and there are a lot of people who are really, really brilliant at it. And then there's me. I'm not in that category. The writing laughs, the distinction is a laugh is from character. A joke can, you know, you can take a joke out of its context and just say it,
Right.
and it's funny because it's a joke. There's a setup, there's a punchline. A laugh is something that, without the context of the character and the scene, wouldn't be funny at all.
A laugh is better.
Well, in the theater, I think laughs are better, because in the theater, it's a richer laugh because it's based on character.
Yeah.
So, and those are fun to write, and I can write those. And the great joy is when suddenly it occurs to you, because it's not always when you're writing the scene the first time. Although Bob, damn him, seems to have the skill to do that, the talent to do that. He seems to his first drafts of things are just hilariously funny. My first drafts of things are, this is what the scene's about. And then I look at it and look at it and look at it, or I act it out and act it out and act it out, until I think, until something occurs to me. Like,
okay, so that's the evolution of your writing. Okay, that's how you go.
You know, I can give you an example. There's a scene with Mary and Frankie in Jersey Boys where they meet and they go to a pizza place, Mangio's Pizza. And because they don't sell slices. This is like a fancy pizza place. So they don't sell slices.
And
then Mary, the first person to say the word fuck in the show.
Hell yeah.
Yes, there we go.
Which we just thought it was amusing that the woman would say it first.
Page 24.
Says, you can't end it. You can't end in a Y. You can't end Valli, Vally, which is how Frankie was originally going to spell it. You can't do that because you're Italian, Castelluccio, Delgado, pizza. The pizza wasn't there when we wrote the script. But we were at a rehearsal and we were watching Jen and David Noronha rehearsing this in La Jolla. David Noronha playing Frankie Valli and Jen Nemo playing Mary Delgado. And Des had staged it with sitting at a table, and there was like a giant pan as a prop, in the rehearsal that represented the pizza prop that didn't exist yet. And I was sitting there, and I looked over to Marshall and I said, "Well, it's like going to be right there. She's got to say pizza."
Yeah.
So we took a Post-it and handed it over to Des, and Des said, "Okay, after Delgado Castelluccio, say pizza." And that's how pizza was born. Only because watching the thing, that would be funny. Funny because of character, right, and situation. So that's an example of what I mean. Coming in after the fact and going, "Oh yeah, that'll be funny."
Right. There's a practicality to it.
Well, it's, I imagine, I can only dream what it would be like to be able to just write funny stuff. But, it's the funny stuff that occurs to me usually comes from behavior or situation. And so I have to kind of, so I'm always lagging. I'm always, bringing up the rear on that.
So would you say you are a method writer in terms of like morphing yourself into a voice that you want to write for?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what that, I'm not quite sure.
Is that a thing? Well, it's just something I just made up now.
Well, no, I mean, I know what a method actor is, but I mean, I don't know that it's not, I don't know that that's how I would say it, but maybe it's just that it's important to have a voice in your head that's not your own voice. Okay. So if that's what you mean by method writer,
yes,
then yes. But I think it's good you want your characters to not sound like they are all the same person, because that's not good writing. That's, at the very least, that's lazy writing. You want your characters to be distinct one from the other. And in order to do that, since you're one person, you need to think of different voices for characters. And what I usually do is I think of somebody in real life or a character, and think about how that person sounds. And then I just sort of store it away and with all the other voices until it's time to write the scene. And the fun part is, when you get to write a scene with 6 or 7 or 8 characters talking, because most scenes don't do that. Most scenes are 2 people or 3 people. It's because it's hard to write. It's hard to keep 6 or 7 or 8 distinct voices in your head without being a crazy person.
Right. So the sit down scene, that's the one with most people talking at once, I would say. And like
it's a long scene too. It's a very unusual in a musical to see a scene that's like 5 or 6 pages long without a piece of music in it. Very, very rare in a musical to have a scene that long.
Right. How challenging was it to write that scene?
Oh, it wasn't challenging at all. It was great fun to write that scene. Well, it's the great scene. It's like, like, let's pretend we're Nick Pileggi and we're writing a scene for a Scorsese movie. This is going to be wonderful, but also we had very, very early on, I think from the very first thing that we'd written for Bob and Frankie was something about Nick being very, very fastidious and having a problem rooming with Tommy. None of which was true. We just made that up. We didn't know that we made it. We didn't know it wasn't true or not. We just made it up. And Tommy. Full disclosure, Tommy, was always a little bit pissed off at us because Tommy was not the way he's described in the play, but he was good-natured about it and didn't make a big deal about it because he knew that it worked as a scene, but to differentiate them. But the idea that Nick and Tommy were roommates who had friction between them was more interesting than they got along fine. But so that was the the Nick part of the sit down scene was one of the earliest runs that we'd written. So we had that.
Okay.
And we also had a very, very clear idea of what the scene needed to be, which is the band's in real trouble and it's the end of the group. And Frankie decides to do something extraordinary, which is, the band takes the debt. And as a way to keep the band together, and the group still falls apart. And we knew that those events had to happen.
Right.
And so we wrote the version that's pretty much unchanged from the very first time we wrote it to what's in the show now, although there was a point where, because it was not historically accurate, it's another, feels authentic versus actually is authentic. What actually happened is that Nick left the group before Tommy DeVito did. Right. And at one point, Frankie called from somewhere, maybe Atlantic City, and something had been, weighing on his mind, and he said, it's just not true. And, he felt like it was disrespectful to Nick or something. And he said, I really want it to be the way it really happened, which is that Nick leaves and then Tommy leaves, which of course is an easy thing to say over the phone, but it's a killer to change because that changes everything in the second act of the show. Changes everything. Changes that scene, but also changes everything that happens, for Nick in that section and every song choice and all that stuff. So, but we did it because when Frankie said, I really want you to do it, we would give it the old college try, and we did it. And to his great credit, he said, this isn't as good, is it? It's not as good as a play. No, it's not, Frank. No. He said, all right, well, we can go back to the other way, because of course they, again, this is their lives, this is their group. They have what really happened. And if the show were to be successful, we didn't know at the time whether it would or not, but if the show were to be successful, the show would be construed as what really happened, because that's what success does,
Right, yes.
And or more people would know the story. It's like Forte and Fort, people would know the wrong thing as the right thing. And so what do you do with the right thing? But he was he was clever enough and sophisticated enough about theater, even though he's not a theater guy. He just was instinctively sophisticated enough to understand that Tommy leaving, the character that we needed Tommy to be in the Shakespearean sense, Tommy being the sort of the Shakespearean villain of the story of the Four Seasons, needed to resolve with Tommy being, having to leave, Tommy having to pay the price for what he had done to get the band in that fix. And even though that's not exactly the timing that it happened in real life, it makes a better shape in terms of drama.
I think this is a great place to wrap up. Yeah.
Gee, the hours have flown by like weeks. I don't understand.
Us too. Thank you guys so much for listening. This was our season 2 opener with
our premiere.
Rick Elice.
The verbose Rick Elice.
No.
Don't hold me accountable for anything I've said, ladies and gentlemen and children. I'm just trying to be a Jersey Boys fan. That's all I am really now at this point in my life.
Well,
you guys are great. I've very much enjoyed meeting you.